Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be continuing our discussion of Shintō. Because our previous feed drop of the Genpei War from the Nihonshi podcast, forthcoming in 2026, was received so well, I've decided to do another 3-part feed drop where I will be narrating the origin myths of Japan, as told in the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki. While this will be a feed drop, it will also serve as parts 4, 5, and 6 of our Asian religion series on Shintō. Today will be part 1, where I describe methods of studying origins of civilizations and cultures, and where I narrate the Kojiki and part of the Nihon Shoki up through the birth of the very famous goddess Amaterasu. Again, this is part 1 of a 3-part series, and so please continue to join me in the coming weeks as we talk through the entirety of the Nihon Shoki and Kojiki. We hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. This is episode 1 of a 3-part series called Origins. In it, I will discuss sources and methods in investigating the origin myths of Japan, and I'll also discuss origin myths themselves in depth. At the end, I will also take some time to discuss the major themes, takeaways, and points of interest of the myths, and I'll connect them to modern and ongoing narratives of Japanese identity, culture, religion, and more. Let's get started. First, I wanted to give a brief discussion of methods for studying the origins of a particular culture or civilization. This may seem obvious, but it's actually a very difficult thing. There are multiple approaches, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. One can look at archaeological evidence, if there is any, and make inferences about what life was like in ancient times based on that evidence. For example, if there are orderly cemeteries with skeletons all in the same configuration underground, we can infer that that culture buried their dead. If their pottery has images inscribed or painted onto it, we can infer information about their myths, legends, and folklore. The strength of this is that archaeological evidence comes to you unbiased. It is what it is, and it's up to scholars to decide what its significance is. That, however, is also its weakness. It lacks context and explanation, and the scholar has to guess at what context and explanation could be surrounding that piece of evidence. This is done with evidence and with all available information, so it's not blind guessing, but when there is a lack of available evidence and information, there can be a lot of uncertainty and unknowns. Additionally, archaeological evidence is potentially very hard to come by, and this is a very significant problem for the Japanese context in particular. Another approach is textual. We can read the earliest dating texts containing myths and histories about cultures and about their origins. This has the strength of being information about the past presented with context and explanation. It could tell the story of how a people migrated from one place to another, or how the institution of the king or emperor came to exist with the first of such rulers. This information could be provided with names, places, and dates that scholars can easily reference to paint a picture of history. Again, however, its explanation and context is also its weakness. It could be a biased presentation, a presentation that erases and downplays certain things for certain purposes, or a presentation that is entirely imaginary and is completely inaccurate to what the actual events of history were. More difficult still is a mythical or myth-historical text, which mixes real events in history with mythical stories. These texts tell scholars a great deal about what a particular culture thinks about its own origins at a particular time, but in all likelihood, very little of that will be relatable to what actually happened in the distant past. Most available texts on the origins of a people are myth histories, and so they are often looked at together with archaeological evidence to paint a complete picture of the past and distinguish between what is myth and legend and what is historical. This is an ongoing and ever incomplete process, but the further we get, the more we are pretty sure we know about the past and about the origins of a particular culture and people. When studying the origins of Japan, the Japanese culture and civilization, we make use of all available evidence in this fashion. Before we get too far into how we do this, I would like to discuss a few of the assumptions and preconceptions that one might want to leave behind before setting off on this journey. When we say the origins of Japanese culture, or the origins of Japan, it may seem to imply that Japan, or has been Japanese, for all time. We may want to think that the borders of the country today have been the same for all of history. It may seem to imply that Japaneseness is real, and that the idea of Japan is based in concrete fact. Neither is the case. Japan is a nation-state, and nation-states as the smallest operative unit of geopolitics is a product of recent world history. Japan is an idea that is invented by the people in Japan and in the rest of the world. Similarly, the ethnic term Japanese is completely socially constructed. It's an ethnicity or a culture with artificially constructed distinctions between it and Korean, Chinese, and Russian ethnicities. And this is true of all ethnicities. All race and all ethnicity is a social construct. We observe specificities and vagaries in DNA and artificially ascribe names and categories to them for ethnicity, and we observe differences in appearance and behavior and artificially ascribe names and categories and identities to them for race. Japan is no different. As we discuss the origins of Japan, we will see that the Japanese archipelago is populated as a result of waves of migration of peoples from the lands of modern-day Korea, China, and Russia. And so, as a result, Japanese people are actually descendants and relatives of other peoples. Similarly, the lands encompassed by the borders of the modern nation-state of Japan are not populated only by what we would call Japanese people. There are indigenous groups, particularly the Ainu to the north and the Ryukyuans to the south, which are culturally and ethnically different from those we would typically call Japanese. However, just because ethnicity and race and nationhood are contrived and artificially constructed does not mean that those ideas don't play a significant role for hundreds of millions of people in Japan for millennia of history. Identity and culture matter even if they are social constructs. So as we journey into the origins of Japan, we're dealing with something that is critically important to Japanese identity. We are dealing with that which centers the Japanese people in time, in geography, in the cosmos, in their own individual lives, in their collective existence, in the community of cultures all over the world, and more. Origin stories are compasses, and they function as such throughout history as they are used and referred to over and over again throughout a particular people or nation or culture's history. So as you can see, we're in for a complicated journey. Let's start with the mythical origins of Japan, and then later we'll move on to the historical and archaeological narratives that we have. The myths of the origins of Japan come from primarily two texts, the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki. These are two of the oldest extant texts in Japanese history, and they were both compiled in the first half of the 8th century CE by no Yasumaro at the request of Empress Genmei, in the case of the Kojiki, the older text, and the Nihon Shoki was under the editorial supervision of Prince Toneri, with the assistance of no Yasumaro at the request of Empress Gensho. These two texts tell distinctly different stories and serve distinctly different purposes, but they are amalgamated and fused into singular and universal origin stories over the course of history. We will talk a lot about the purpose and context of these two texts, but in brief, they sought to centralize and standardize the myths, history, and legends of the young empire of Yamato, a polity which existed in southern central Japan. We believe that the center of government of this polity was in or near present-day Nara, near modern-day Kyoto and Osaka. Many origin myths and imperial histories throughout the entire world serve this type of purpose. They attempt to establish unbroken lines of succession, mythical origins of groups of people, and also attempt to explain the beginning of time and the beginning of civilization and culture itself. Around these things, people construct a shared identity and a sense of belonging and relationship. Additionally, these unbroken lines of succession and their mythical origins support and legitimize the rule of the current ruler, and they give divine context and support to the status quo. Therein lies the bias that we must attempt to see through. Was there an unbroken line of succession, beginning with one divine ruler and ending with the current one? In the case of Japan, all evidence outside of the mythical Kojiki and Nihon Shoki texts and our common sense would both suggest no, absolutely not. There was no such unbroken divine lineage. In fact, one purpose of the Kojiki text is thought to be to revise history to smooth over a usurpation in the imperial lineage that had occurred not too long before the text's authorship. But just because this text is mythical, revisionist, and biased history doesn't mean that it isn't crucial to examine, as it is all part of the identity construction and the agenda of the compilers and the text. So let's get into the myth itself. Both the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki texts open after the appearance of the heavens and the earth. This is uncommon among origin myths, as most seek to start at the very, very, very beginning and proceed onward from there. There are many possible reasons why it doesn't start with the birth of the whole universe, with one of the most likely being that this was not meant to be a history of the world as we know it, or as ancient peoples on the Japanese archipelago knew it. It was meant to tell the story of Yamato, the land and the people themselves. The Nihon Shoki presents many different possible origin processes, including the yin and yang origin myth from Chinese mythology, for example. But in both texts, after heaven and earth had appeared, the first generation of gods, known in Japanese as kami, appeared in the realm of heaven. These three gods were collectively known as the Zouka Sanshin, or the three creation gods. The realm of heaven in which they appeared was called Takamagahara, or the high plains of heaven, and their names are Ame no Minaka Nushi, often translated as Master Mighty Center of Heaven or Central Master, Takami Musubi, often translated as Lofty Growth or High Creator, and Kami Musubi, translated as Sacred Growth or Divine Creator. Then two more gods appeared, named Umashi Ashikabi Hikoji, translated as Fine Budding Reed Lad, and Ame no Tokotachi, Heaven or Ever-Standing Heaven. These gods, as well as the Zouka Sanshin, or the creator gods, are collectively known as the Kodo Amatsukami. This name has been translated in a number of different ways. It could be the distinguishing heavenly gods or the distinguished heavenly gods. This translation does not matter too much for this text, as these gods don't do much of anything, but it's important to note that many creation myths have this theme of distinguishing as part of the mode of creation. So, creator gods will often say, this is this and not that. That is that and not this. And that is their mode by which they create. They're creating order from chaos by creating distinctions and applying them to the world. These gods, however, don't do any of that. These 5 Kodo Amatsukami are referred to in the text as solitary or hidden, or are said to conceal themselves so that they're invisible. The meaning of this is not well known, but the theme of concealment and visible invisibility of that which is most holy or divine will run through these origin stories all the way through to the present day, and will shape how sacred relics and even sacred people, such as the emperor and the imperial family, are treated. After these 5 Koto Amatsukami appeared, 7 generations of gods appeared, known as the Kamiyo Nanayo, literally translated to 7 generations of the age of the gods. Among these gods were the famous Izanami and Izanagi. These 2 gods are twin brother and sister, as well as husband and wife. Sibling spouse couples are extremely common in origin myths, such as Kronos and Rhea in Greek myth, Isis and Osiris in Egyptian myth, Nuwa and Fuxi in Chinese myth, Set and Nephthys, again in Egyptian myth. The list goes on. Izanagi is the male, and Izanami is the female. I remember it because Izanagi is the guy, and Izanami is the maiden, but I still mix them up from time to time. Their names mean he who beckoned and she who beckoned. After they appear, the gods of the heavenly plains command Izanagi and Izanami to make firm this drifting land and fashion it in its final form, and they give them a jeweled heavenly halberd, or spear, called Ame no Nuhoko, heavenly spear. The pair stand on a floating bridge of heaven, Ame no Ukihashi, and from this bridge they churn the spear in the ocean water and in the brine below, and from the tip of the spear drips clumps of mud and brine and salt, and these pile up into the first island of Japan. The first island is called Onogoroshima, or self-shaped isle, and the pair descend from heaven onto this island. This island has a pillar in the center of a big spacious hall. The pillar is called Ame no Mihashira, pillar of heaven, and the pair begin a very sexualized dialogue. Izanagi speaks to Izanami and says something like, "How is your body formed?" or "What is the shape of your body?" And she says, "My body is empty in one place," referring to her having female genitalia. And he says, "My body sticks out in one place," and indicates his intention to have sexual intercourse with her in order to birth many more lands. She says that sounds fine, and they begin a ritual mating dance by walking around the pillar. Izanami told her, "You circle from the right to meet me, and I will circle from the left to meet you." Then Izanami, apparently so stricken with lust or otherwise with anticipation, spoke, saying, "What a fine boy." And Izanagi said, "What a fine girl." They pledge themselves to each other, and then Izanagi tells her that it wasn't right that she spoke first, and that no good comes of women speaking first. Still, they had sex, but the child came out without any arms or legs, and it was called Hiruko, which literally means leech child. This child would go on to become the Shintō god Ebisu, and is worshipped as the patron deity of fishermen and good luck. They put it on a boat of reeds and sent it out to sea to kill it, and then they made another child named Awashima, or Froth Island. They also sent this child away on a boat, thinking it was no good, and after discussing it with each other, they went back up to heaven to ask why the children were coming out with deformities, and the gods said that it was because the woman spoke first. They have to go back and try walking around the pillar again, but this time, Izanagi must speak first. If they do this, the gods say their children will be strong and healthy. Right here is one of the textual origin points for gender issues in Japanese culture. Japan is one of the most highly developed countries in the world in the modern day, and yet it consistently ranks as low as the 120th or 130th place, or thereabouts, for gender equality out of all recognized nation-states. This myth isn't the only reason for that, but this is one of the places where we can see sexism appear and start to play a huge role in Japanese culture and society. So, Izanami and Izanagi redo their ritual, with Izanagi speaking first, and the consummation of their marriage is successful, and they begin to birth all manner of lands. From their union were born the Oyashima, or the Great Eight Islands of the Japanese chain, as well as 6 minor islands. The 8 major islands are Awaji, Iyo, which is later called Shikoku, Oki, Tsukushi, which is later called Kyushu, Iki, Tsushima, Sado, and Yamato, later called Honshu. It's important to note that Hokkaido and Okinawa were not part of the original conception of the lands of Japan. Hokkaido is a conquered land added to the Japanese archipelago in the 19th century, and Okinawa was added in World War II. Nevertheless, we see the other 3 main islands of Shikoku, the southernmost main island of Japan, Kyushu, the westernmost, and Honshu, the largest island. The rest of these islands are some of the smaller islands off the coasts of the larger ones. Awaji is in the Seto Inland Sea between Shikoku and Honshu. Oki is off the west coast of Kyushu. Iki and Tsushima are off the north coast of Kyushu near the Korean peninsula, and Sado is off the west coast of Honshu in the Sea of Japan. These are just the biggest islands of the Japanese archipelago, which is composed of 14,125 islands in total, with new ones still forming due to oceanic volcanic activity. Of course, many of these islands, especially the youngest and smallest ones, are uninhabited. Additionally, as we have mentioned, what we would call the Japanese sovereign territory of 2025 did not correspond to how the Japanese people viewed themselves at the time of the authorship of this text. So, the text continues to say that Izanami and Izanagi continued by creating deities and spirits to inhabit these lands, numbering 35 in total. At this stage, Izanami is said to die giving birth to the fire god, Kagutsuchi. When this happens, Gustav Heidt, a very well-renowned scholar and translator of the Kojiki, writes, quote, "And so the mighty one, he who beckoned, declared, 'Sweet sister, my mighty one, have I exchanged you for a single child?' And so declaring, he crawled around her mighty head, and he crawled around her mighty feet, weeping and wailing all the while. Now the mighty one, he who beckoned, unsheathed the sword 10 handspans long that was girded by his mighty side, and beheaded his child, the spirit, flickering elder, Kagutsuchi." Unquote. Izanagi killed Kagutsuchi, and all the while there were spirits being born out of his tears, the blood of Kagutsuchi that splattered on his sword, his hand, his body, and many more. This is a very fascinating bit of the story. Fire is often thought to be the invention or the discovery by primitive man that brought about culture and brought about civilization. There are several scholarly works out there that look at the history and the anthropology of humanity, and they say that the transition from raw to cooked was the transition from primitive to civilized, or at least the transition from wild to domestic or to tribal. So it's fascinating always to see fire enshrined as a god, in this case in the form of Kagutsuchi, but it's also very interesting to see these stories where fire kills its wielder or where fire kills whoever brings it into the human population. In this case, it seems to have killed Izanami, who brought it into the world. This is reminiscent perhaps of the Greek myth of Prometheus bringing down the fire from Mount Olympus and being punished for it for all eternity. At this point in the story, Izanagi wants to go to the underworld, the land of Yomi, to see Izanami, who has just died. He says that they have not yet finished making lands, and tries to get her to come back with him. However, Izanagi arrived too late. Izanami says that she has eaten the food of the underworld, and now she might not be able to leave. She has to go and talk to the spirits of the underworld of Yomi. Now this is very important. While she is conferring with the spirits, she implores Izanagi not to speak with her. However, Izanagi missed her too much, so he made a torch out of his comb that he had been carrying, and he made a light to see her. When he did this, he saw that she had become a rotting corpse. This caused him to become very frightened and to flee. This sets a sort of precedent for the rest of Japanese religious history, where death, dead things, decay, and so on come to be regarded as morally and spiritually polluted and polluting. First, it was Izanagi's transgressive look when she had asked him not to. Second, it was the fact that in eating the food of the underworld, Izanami had become polluted or had become tainted or had become one with the land of the dead. In more concrete terms, she had begun to decompose, and so this made her impure and unfit for returning to the land of the living. Later in Japan's history, we'll discuss points in time where the imperial capital was moved every time an emperor died, potentially for the purpose of mitigating the death pollution that resulted from that death, lest it cast a literal pall on the new emperor's reign, causing bad luck, pestilence, and misfortune. Izanami was offended by the fact that Izanagi could not look upon her as a rotting corpse, and so she sent witches and hags to chase him. He gets out his big sword again, and that doesn't work for fighting off the witches and hags, so he comes upon a peach tree, still in the underworld, and he grabs a few peaches, and he strikes a very threatening pose. This causes the witches to leave him alone, and he makes a vow to the peaches. Quote, "As you have aided me, so may you also aid any green grass mortal from the central realm of reed plains who encounters pain and suffering." And so proclaiming, he bestowed on them the title of Mighty One, Great Sacred Majesty. Unquote. This is a very fascinating inclusion for a number of reasons. One reason is that peaches are symbolic of immortality in Chinese myth. That is, people who practice asceticism and deep meditation and propitiate the divine bureaucracy of gods in the Chinese folklore are eventually welcomed to eat peaches from the garden of the gods, and these peaches grant the person their sage status and their immortality. This means that they become all-knowing, they gain the ability to fly and become invisible, they gain the ability to travel the realm of the spirits as well as the land of the living, and they of course live forever. The peaches being included in the land of Yomi, or the underworld here, speaks to the fact that once somebody dies, they're dead forever. They may live on in immortality in the underworld, but they do not and cannot come back. This inclusion of peaches in this context is enough evidence for me to suggest that there is some influence from mainland cultures, which are not yet called China at this point, on the texts and on the myth. The other interesting aspect of this inclusion is that there is a very famous folk hero who is born out of a peach. His name is Momotaro, which literally translates to child of a peach, or peach boy. It's not very plausible that the legend of Momotaro existed at the time of the authorship of the Kojiki, but it is possible that the legend of Momotaro might draw some influence and inspiration from the Kojiki and Izanagi's high praise of peaches. So, back to the regularly scheduled programming. The hags have left Izanagi, and so now Izanami decides to chase him down instead. He decides to heft a giant boulder in between them and declares the two of them divorced. This angers Izanami greatly, and she declares that she will kill 1,000 of his offspring every day. He responds by saying something to the effect of, "Oh yeah? Well, I will birth 1,500 mortals every day." They do this, and so the population grows by a net total of 500 individuals per day. This scene has been looked at by scholars and historians as a potential mythical depiction of a war between individuals where one party sends overwhelming waves of fighters who win Pyrrhic victories over the other party. Perhaps it might be an invasion from one area of the region to another, such as from the Korean peninsula to the archipelago, or from the northern parts of the archipelago to the southern, or a tribal conflict, or something to that effect. This is possible since we do have archaeological evidence of waves of migration to populate what we now call Japan. It's also hypothesized that it could be an epidemic, given that Izanami now has a strong association with death. Maybe the plague or the epidemic of that time came to be mythologized as Izanami herself. Southern and central Japan struggled with epidemics of malaria and other diseases throughout much of pre-modern history, and so this could have caused the deaths described here. So after this whole ordeal, there is a scene which again demonstrates the theme of death pollution mentioned earlier, wherein Izanagi declares that he feels foul and filthy, and he intends to bathe himself. He does so, and this ritual, which purifies the death pollution from his body, comes to be called misogi. This is a very central ritual in the quote-unquote religion that comes to be called Shintō in the modern era. Shintō is notoriously oriented toward propping up and legitimating the imperial bloodline, and so it would make sense that this ritual comes up in an imperially sponsored work. The ritual is basically to bathe oneself in a blessed body of water or under a waterfall, and this purifies your soul morally and also in a very concrete and real way. With every single piece of clothing that he tossed away, with every body part that he washed, and every bit of water that he went, more and more spirits are born. Of these many spirits, there are 3 incredibly important ones who were born. These are the 3 most important kami in all of Japanese history. They are known in Japanese by a couple of different names, either the Mihashira no Uzu no Miko or the Sun Kishi. And they are the sun goddess Amaterasu Omikami, the moon deity Tsukuyomi no Mikoto, and the storm god Susanoo no Mikoto. They were born when Izanagi washed his left eye, his right eye, and his nose, respectively. Tsukuyomi does not appear very much, but Amaterasu and Susanoo are sibling rivals, and we get lots of stories of their 2 shenanigans together. But if you want to hear more about what they get up to together, you'll have to wait until our next installment in this 3-part series on the origin myths of Japan. Join me next time for part 2, where I will be starting with Amaterasu and working my way all the way through the life of Japan's first mythical emperor, Jinmu. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week for more exciting discussions of Japanese history. This has been Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. Hi everybody, Bright on Buddhism Nick here. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this 3-part series on the origin myths of Japan. Like I mentioned earlier, this episode functions as a feed drop for the Nihonshi podcast, which will be coming out in 2026. And it also serves as part 4, 5, and 6 of our Asian religion series on Shintō. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.